to help us understand what all those numbers mean is parliamentary budget watchdog Yves Giroux. Hi, Mr. Giroux. Good to have you here.
My pleasure.
I appreciate you making the time. The big headline for me is around the spending required, because that target was finally announced in July, but we still had no idea how things were going to progress there. Can you lay out for us how much more the government would have to spend on defense between now and when they anticipate hitting 2%?
So right now, the Department of National Defense and other expenditures that are counted towards military spending by NATO, such as the Coast Guard, for example, that's expected to amount to $41 billion this year, assuming all of it gets spent, which is a big if. So that's about 1.35% of GDP, sorry. And if the government is indeed meeting the NATO target of spending 2% of GDP on military expenditures by 2032-33, that would mean going from $41 billion to almost $82 billion in 2032-33.
Contextualize that for us. How big of a chunk of government spending would that be in general?
Well, that would be a doubling, obviously, current expenditures. And that is almost the amount that we are spending on old age security in a year for the entire country. That's about $81 billion.
And what would that do to the balance of the budget?
And that's what we looked at in this context, in the context of this report, because the government has two fiscal anchors that are important. The first is a declining debt to GDP ratio over the medium term, and that, if the government was to meet the target of 2%, that would still happen. We'd still see a declining debt to GDP ratio. The other fiscal anchor the government has committed to is having deficits that are lower than 1% of GDP starting in 2026-27. And that's what would be much more difficult to achieve. In fact, if the government proceeds as planned with its defense plans and meets the 2% target in 2032-33, it would be very difficult to meet the 1% deficit as in respect or as a share of GDP in 26-27, 27-28, and 32-33. It would be above.
So right away, it becomes very difficult to meet your fiscal anchors.
Yes, immediately, as the moment, the year in which this fiscal anchor is supposed to be binding, it will be very difficult to meet without reducing spending elsewhere or increasing taxes.
I was just going to say, unless they augment in another way to make up for $40 billion a year.
Yes.
Which is, again, no small chunk of change.
Yes, it's a gradual increase, but still, it's billions of dollars in additional spending each and every year to get to $82 billion.
The other significant part of this analysis that we outlined in the introduction is, what is a portion of GDP and the calculation of that? Can you explain to people watching basically the conclusion you arrived at when it comes to whether we actually are at the percentage of GDP we think we are?
Yeah, so when you have a target like 2% of GDP to military spending, you have to know what it is, what's your GDP, and estimating that in the future is done by private sector forecasters, by the Department of Finance, by us. But the numbers that the Department of Finance use imply a recession for 4 years, a 4-year recession starting in 2026-27, because the growth rate they use is below inflation, which would imply a recession. We've pointed that out to the Department of National Defense, and they said, our numbers are our numbers. They're presumably taken from NATO or the OECD, but we couldn't find these numbers anywhere. So we used our forecasts for GDP, which are very similar to those of the Department of Finance, and we arrive at a share of GDP allocated to spending, to military spending, that is significantly lower than what the government has indicated.
What is the difference?
The difference is 0.18% of GDP, which sounds like not a lot.
What does that mean in real life?
But in 2030, it means $6.5 billion.
Okay.
So that's the difference.
And so the minister appeared in those comments that he made that we aired to be pushing back, saying exactly what you did, that NATO sort of has this formula, NATO has numbers that it uses, and they're just using that. And ultimately, if NATO is going to judge us by that metric, then that would appear to make sense. And I don't know, what's your response to that?
It would appear, except that there's no such forecast that we could find on NATO, from NATO or the OECD, that has the numbers the department is using. So they're using lower numbers for GDP, I think it's an honest mistake, but even when we pointed that out to the Department of National Defense, they didn't update or change these numbers. And the result is that, according to the government, and if they use these erroneous numbers, then they can still claim to meet certain targets, even though they likely won't.
And how far off does it push that target, like meeting that target then?
By a couple of years if they use these erroneous numbers.
Okay, so that is a discernible difference.
Yeah, and as I said, it's $6.5 billion difference using theirs versus ours numbers in 2030.
Because I have you here, I wanted to ask you one more question. You had done some analysis of kind of the fiscal situation of the government more recently, and I noticed kind of out of the corner of my eye, the deficit was bigger than it had been projected to be. Can you sort of outline for us how much bigger you're anticipating it might be and what the factors contributing to that are?
We are anticipating a deficit for the year that ended in March of about $47 billion, which is $7 billion higher than what the last budget indicated it would be, and about the same difference for the current fiscal year, still $47 billion, where the government was forecasting a slightly smaller deficit, slightly below $40 billion. And it's in good part due to increased spending, which is more than offsetting additional revenues, better than expected revenues, but the government is spending more than these additional revenues on program expenditures, operating expenditures, and interest on the debt.
Oh, really? And those programs, for example, that spending was not already accounted for in the budget?
It was, but we're seeing, it should have been, but we're seeing an increased pace of spending.
Okay, and then when it comes to what you anticipate going forward, based on economic conditions, based on the spending pattern stuff that they've introduced, what is your anticipation? I heard you say it's already a bit bigger, but how much do you think that continues?
It's hard to say given the uncertainty currently and the fact that we haven't seen the real final numbers for the year that ended in March 31st. So we should have seen the public accounts, the final numbers for the year that ended. We haven't seen them. So it's hard to forecast how much of that difference will be affecting future subsequent years without having seen the real number from the government.
When do you think you'll see those real numbers?
Well, by legislation, it has to be before December 31st, but ideally it should be in September, and we're already at the very end of October. So now would be a very good time.
Okay, I'll leave it on that. Mr. Giroux, appreciate your time as always. Thank you.
Always.